hosted by the Center for Western Studies at Augustana University, the launch of the new book, America's Longest River, about the Missouri River, a river that we all know very well if we live on the northern plains. I want to begin our session with three thank yous. First of all, I wanted to do a thank you and a remembrance of John E. Miller, a longtime professor of history at SDSU that probably 80% of the people in this room know and remember. He passed away 6 years ago, suddenly, when he was in his writing prime and cranking out books left and right. And he was an expert on South Dakota, Midwestern history, and we miss him a great deal. But I wrote an obituary for him for the Brookings Register, and a young lady by the name of Jan Johnson read that obituary on the front page. They put it on the front page of the Brookings Register, and she sent me a message through Facebook. This is one of the good uses of technology in this world, and she said, I loved John Miller. I worked with him on a bunch of projects in small town history, and I would love to help remember him. What should we do? And I said, we should do a book about South Dakota history in honor of John Miller, and it was sponsored by Jan Johnson here. Please raise your hand, John. Thank her for making that possible. And then, when we finished that project, she said, what should we do next? And I said, well, how about a book on the Missouri River? And so we got working on this three or 4 years ago, and finally it's come to life here today at the Center for Western Studies. But I want to thank the generosity of Jan Johnson and her family for making this book possible. Lastly, I want to thank Harry Thompson, the guru of the Center for Western Studies, a mentor to a lot of us. As I said of Jesse Jackson, he's the straw that stirs the drink around here. And he launched a lot of projects and encouraged a lot of younger scholars, including myself. I think I started presenting at the Dakota Conference in 1993 and have missed very few since then. But it was a great pleasure to work with Harry on this book on the Missouri River. Lastly, I just wanted to make a note. I saw in yesterday's New York Times there was a story about Norman McLean and his famous book, A River Runs Through It. And the context of this article was, would a book like A River Runs Through It be published today? And it was barely published in 1976. It was rejected by 36 New York publishers until the University of Chicago Press picked it up. But I thought it was fitting that the Times was talking about Norman McLean today because, of course, his great adventures started in the upper watershed of the Missouri River. Now, everyone thinks that he only fished on the other side of the Rockies on the Blackfoot. But in the process of working on this book and writing this intro, I talked to Norman McLean's son, who's a retired journalist and a great guy and very fun. And he said, if you want to fly fish in Montana now, the hot area is the Missouri River. Forget about the Blackfoot. Go to the Missouri. So I thought that was a good way to begin our discussion about the Missouri River. If you want to go fly fishing, that's the place to be. So without further ado, I encourage you to read the book. A lot of you have had many experiences with the river, and don't hesitate to send us a note and tell us what you think, tell us what we left out, and we'll have more discussions about the river in this book and upcoming conferences. Next, I want to introduce Harry, my co-editor on the book, and he's going to offer a few more comments. And thank Harry again for all his work.
Thanks, John. It's been a pleasure to work with you, not only on this book, but several other books. You're an idea man, and a publisher needs ideas. We were just talking with Secretary here about where you get ideas for books, and it's not that easy to come by them. and it's even harder to carry them through all the way. I'd like to add my congratulations to the contributors to this book. And as I mentioned at our luncheon, these individuals and the other 29 were thanked also by a very modest gift, given the fact that there are that many of them, made possible by Jan Colby Johnson. And in the humanities, it's not always easy to get any kind of financial remuneration for the years of research that you put into a project. So Jan, thank you. That's a real encouragement, what you've done for both the South Dakota history book and this book. It's a real encouragement, so thank you. Just a few comments from a fellow that not only is the publisher, but also the copy editor. You know, so John reads all these lovely pieces. I read them, and I try to make sure that there is not a consistent voice all the way through the book, but because we want their individual voices, but that there's some regularization all the way through. So I have sometimes a different perspective on a publication. When asked to describe the book, I use the word expansive, which has a nice Western connotation. It is expansive in its geographical sweep, knitting together 7 states: Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri. Imagine that. Is that not a chunk of the United States? It is also expansive in its range of topics related to the defining geophysical characteristic of a major region of the United States. It just happens to be the region that the Center for Western Studies calls its own, the Northern Great Plains, which is not always easy to bring together, you know, from St. Louis all the way to Three Forks, Montana, Three Rivers, Montana. We could almost call it encyclopedia. It's encyclopedic. This became clear to me copy editing the book for publication, but even more so compiling the index. Anybody ever compiled an index for a book? Okay. You remember doing it. It sticks with you. Yeah. This index is spread double column across 16 pages and includes over 1,000 entries. AI was not used because it's so undependable. You get the weirdest things. So to give you a sense of the scope of this book, let me just give you some examples from the index. And they might be kind of surprising to you. 14 occurrences of art and artists, 22 of border and borderlands, 15 of birds and mythology, 21 of bridges, 20 of cattle, 20 of climate, 30 of commerce and commercial, 20 of the Corps of Discovery, and another 20 of Lewis and Clark expedition, 42 of economic, 44 of farm and farming, 40 of floods, flooding, and flood control, 40 of forests, 28 of named military forts, 28 related to the fur trade, 28 to highways and interstates. For Indigenous and Native Americans, there are a total of 76, then 23 specific tribes in addition. Those are all entered in the index. 12 for journalism, media, and newspapers. For the Missouri River, there are too many. The book, the entire book, you know, all 471 pages are the Missouri River. So what do? So I decided lower, upper, and middle Missouri, which works very, very well because that's the way so many of us understand the Missouri River. 18 on novels and novelists, 40 on the prairie, 50 on steamboats and steamboating, 44 on transportation, 40 on weather, and 30 on women. I'm very happy to announce that in our new distribution relationship with the University of Nebraska Press, which took immediately 6 boxes of the book, they have already asked us for another 6 shipments of the book. So it's found a market, John. We're going to go ahead. Yeah. Introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Harry. We'll just go one by one. Our first speaker is Professor Mike Mullen of Augustana University, who's taught here at Augie for many, many years. Well-known lecturer, and students love Mike. So please take it away, Mike.
I will talk loudly, can we? One thing Harry didn't mention is that his edits make the book better. And that's really important. A good editor makes poor writing tolerable. And believe me, he has his work cut out. So, my chapter is entitled Cartography and Trade Before Lewis and Clark. And what I wanted to do is remind readers that the Missouri River was not an unknown quantity when Lewis and Clark, I probably had 18 of the dimensions of Lewis and Clark, was not an unknown quantity when they headed up the river. In fact, there was no science to be done until they got to the Mandan. What Lewis and Clark's instructions were for the southern part, that first summer, was simply to verify the coordinates of earlier mapping. So my first part of the article is talking about that. I then used approximately 10 or 11 maps drawn of the Missouri River before 1814, which is when Nicholas Biddle produced the most famous map of Lewis and Clark. And it begins with the 2 maps in 1673, 1674, the Joliet and Marquette maps, laying out particular ideas that are going to focus or be parts of the Missouri River development. Cartography will only take you part way. The second part of the chapter deals with what maps do not get at. And that is the native competition for control of resources along the Missouri River. Maps simply claim land. It's up to the people that are there, living on the land, to determine who actually owns it. And so if you look at these 10, 11 maps, you see that Euro-Americans enter the Missouri from the north, the Hudson's Bay, from the east, the French, and then from the south, the Spanish. And each of these countries are going to make particular claims to the land and what we can do with the land. And so my chapter, Lewis and Clark, or Cartography and Trade Before Lewis and Clark, aims to give the reader some of the complexity that Lewis and Clark encountered on the Missouri. The chapter ends by arguing that the real importance of Lewis and Clark, scientifically, is what happens in the discovery of the headwaters of the Missouri. What happens after they leave in 1805, heading west. Not what is focused on the getting up the Missouri. It's finding the headwaters, crossing the Rockies, going to the Pacific, coming back, and taking part. And immediately they find themselves involved in the fur trade. So I try and lay out a little known, I would argue, history of the Missouri and a little known period where nations are competing, but so are tribes, for the resources and the right to live on the Missouri River going forward. So that's my chapter.
Thanks, Mike. Our next speaker is Patrick Gary, professor of law down at the Knudsen School of Law in Vermillion, South Dakota, on the Missouri River. Professor Gary just published a book. You may remember this U.S. Supreme Court case from back in the 1880s about a railroad controversy. He just wrote a book about that was published by Paul Grave McMillan, which I commend to you. Also, Pat is a fellow editor on the journal Middle West Review, published out of the University of South Dakota, and he's a great colleague, and I'm sure we'll get this book reviewed. Find a favorable reviewer, Ken.
Well, thank you. Let me begin by adding my thanks to Jan and to Harry and to John. You know, it's a pleasure to work on a project, and for me, and I think for a lot of my co-authors, it's fun to research a matter and to write it, but the really difficult part is that not oftentimes the writing or the research, but then how do you enter it into the stream of intellectual commerce? That's becoming increasingly difficult. So it's just a great honor for us, a privilege for us to have this opportunity. Jan, not very many people do what you do, and we're very appreciative of it, and know that we're more appreciative than we can ever express. And Harry and John, thanks for that big editing job. All we have to do is sit around and be reminded about how late our project is, but you know, thank you for everything. My chapter is on the Missouri River's role in the political development of the area, and I focus on South Dakota. So you don't oftentimes, I think of a river in terms of politics or a political kind of role, but really the Missouri River defined the Dakota Territory really from the beginning. Once the Minnesota became a state out of the Minnesota Territory, you had this land west of Minnesota, east of the Missouri River, which was kind of undefined, and then we began to push for the Dakota Territory. And it was really led in a wave among the leaders with John Todd, who was a cousin of President Lincoln's wife. He developed a trading post in Yankton, and from this trading post developed in 1857, and by 1859 they're presenting a petition for territorial recognition. That is kind of the beginning of when then Dakota becomes embroiled in national politics. The Democratic Congress doesn't want to recognize the territory because they're thinking, well, we don't want to recognize the territory out of which there's just going to be more free states. So with the election of Abraham Lincoln comes the recognition of Dakota Territory, and then it's looking for a territorial capital. Yankton becomes a territorial capital, but in a way we don't know exactly how it comes about. We think that it was due to the lobbying by Mary Todd Lincoln, because William Jayne, the first governor of the territory, when he comes to the territory, automatically goes to Yankton. We don't have any record that he was told to do that, but the officials, the territorial officials, just come to Yankton, and then out of that kind of gives Yankton a big boost, but the territorial legislature has to recognize a territory. There was intense fighting really between Vermilion, Yankton, and Bonham. It's such that Governor Jayne had to, call in the military to sort of supervise and stand guard over these debates that were going on. But Yankton gets the territorial capital, so at the time that it takes the leading political role in the territory, it's also a leading economic port. It's in 1857, it has 3 steamboat stops in Yankton. So Yankton is sort of noted for its steamboat landing position. And by 1869, it's got 143 steamboat stops. So it becomes very prominent. An interesting aspect about Yankton is that it's one of 7 cities then during the 1870s that gets their water levels and water stages reported daily by telegraph. So it becomes that important along with cities like Pittsburgh and St. Louis. Because of its leadership role, then it becomes a leader in the statehood movement. We have a number of different constitutional conventions in Dakota for recognizing South Dakota statehood. Yankton is a leader in that movement. In 1883, a lot happens there. They called for the first state constitutional convention. Governor Ordway, known for his corruption, vetoes it. But that same year, he moves the territorial capital from Yankton, with whom he's never gotten along, up to Bismarck, also on the Missouri. So Yankton loses that territorial capital, but still retains the sort of the political leadership in the statehood movement. Eventually, South Dakota gets statehood, again tied up with national politics. They don't get it until the Republicans take the 1888 elections then. Once again, this time the Democrats don't want states to come in, which would be 2 states, which are going to vote Republican. So national politics sort of influences it then, although there's an interesting story kind of tied up with, again, the river in a way. South Dakota may have gotten statehood as early as 83 or 84, but along with this first railroad that came into the territory, Yankton had issued railroad bonds. There was a whole, out of which John mentioned this Supreme Court case, many disputes and conflicts involving it. Yankton decides to suspend payments on those bonds. The bondholders convince a Republican senator from Maine to defend themselves, so he kind of holds off statehood as a kind of pressure point on Yankton to pay off the bonds. But that's when the Republicans controlled Congress. They could have gotten statehood then in 84, but because of that conflict, they didn't. And then, of course, once we have statehood, with the river at least, in terms of like its political importance, I think as well as its economic importance, things gradually shift to the railroads. And with that, Sioux Falls becomes a railroad center, and with that, maybe both Yankton and the Missouri River, recede, at least in maybe economic and political importance. Thank you.
As I was listening to Pat, I was noticing the art on the wall, a lot of art of the Missouri River itself, Big Sioux River, tributary of the river. So, and there's a chapter in the book about art about the river. So, if that's your particular interest, you are covered. Our next speaker is Darcy Reeves East. She's a professor of English at Augustana University, where she teaches American literature, literary theory, and environmental literature. A few years ago, she published the book Surveillance and Terror in Post-9/11 British and American Television. That was published by Palgrave Macmillan, just like Professor Gary's book. Please welcome Darcy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. I realize this topic is a little different than surveillance and terrorism, but as a English professor, someone interested in language, my focus was on journalistic reporting about flooding in the Missouri River, particularly around the Omaha and Council Bluffs area, since I'm originally from Omaha, grew up there, and how flooding there was reported from 1952 to 2019. What this started out as is I was always intrigued by an article in my mom's 1952 yearbook from the University of Omaha, which is now University of Nebraska, Omaha, about the 1952 flood and how students helped with sandbagging and trying to keep the river at bay. And I thought, when I grew up, I never experienced any flooding, so I thought, oh, what's all this about? So for this article, I decided to go into the Omaha World Herald archives and look at what was happening. And I was most struck by how journalism was shaping at the time this view of the Missouri River and flooding, because the 52 flood was almost going to be catastrophic to Omaha and Council Bluffs. It nearly was, but the volunteer efforts of so many in the area were able to raise the levees using sandbags, keep it from becoming as bad as it might have been. However, the way it was reported was interesting to me as a modern reader of journalism, and how I would expect it to be reported. It was, the Missouri River was characterized, almost personified, really personified as this enemy that was attacking Omaha, Council Bluffs, and other cities and areas up and down the Missouri, and there was this martial language used in terms of how people were keeping the floodwaters at bay. We were valiantly fighting, and it was a force, and we have our efforts, and we pushed it back, and all this kind of thing. And it made sense, given in '52, you're 7 years from World War II, you're in the Korean War and the Cold War, so it made sense it would have sort of this martial quality. It was also it was all about the, hooray, we all got together and did this. And what wasn't really reported was the fallout, like what did this mean environmentally to the area around Omaha, Council Bluffs, the loss of farmers. These parts were not reported. And certainly it was unquestioning of the intention to install the rest of the Pig Sloan dams up and down the Missouri, right? It was stalled for a while, but this event made it, it pushed through and happened federally, that we need these dams, again, without any consideration. It just was not even on anyone's radar about what would be the ramifications of a dam system up and down the Missouri, anything like that. When you move, though, to the 21st century and catastrophic flooding is happening, this time it's not so much in Omaha, Council Bluffs itself, but kind of to the areas north and south. What you see in the journalistic reporting and what they're telling people is a much more complex story. And so what you partly see is not only new concerns, but how journalism itself evolved over time. Like how it's done. It became way more professionalized. It became more complex. It would situate the context of the story, and it would give multiple points of view on what was happening. And so, to me, this was interesting. So it's a story of journalism, and it's also a story of how the reporting happens. And what you see in 2011 and 2019 for those terrible floods that occurred, you have a lot more somber reporting. The river is no longer some force that's attacking. It's a natural formation, and we have to look at it as such. And what's coming in is the devastation that's happening to a lot of farmers, right? I mean, the Omaha World Herald in the 50s just didn't tell about that. The reporting is very honest and sometimes gut-wrenching, and it's meant to be. But it's also talking about how the fallout from maybe the dam system is the very thing that is now causing this catastrophic flooding today, and talking to experts who are saying, well, you've narrowed the whole channel of the Missouri at this point, and it's not been allowed to take its natural course, and so that's now, creating problems that are exacerbated, so maybe Omaha Council Bluffs now doesn't have to worry about it, but a lot of other places now have to worry about flooding. Of course, climate change comes in too. Today, which is not on the radar in the 50s, but the idea if there's going to be a lot more instability in terms of flooding, maybe severe flooding, other times severe drought, and also the debates between those who have environmental concerns, right, about damming the river further to prevent more flooding, right, that it's going to have fallout for species on, and ecosystems along the Missouri, but those who make their livelihoods, who do want to see more flood control because of their losses in terms of agriculture. So I just thought that this was a very fascinating sort of tour through almost 70 years of how we've changed journalism, how we've changed how we look at natural disasters, how we frame them for an audience. And I end by saying, you know, when I was writing this, it was 2024 and we were flooding, we had the terrible floods here in South Dakota. And, you know, I'm projecting ahead to how will journalism report this going forward, given that print journalism, unfortunately, is becoming a dying thing, and how is this going to be reported on through social media and other kinds of outlets. So it will be interesting to see how it's, you know, environmental change and natural disasters in the Missouri River itself is understood going forward. Thank you.
Darcy mentioned flooding. I think the Corps of Engineers put out last week that the flow into the river this year is 67% of what it normally is. So we're way down this year in comparison to 2 years ago. Our next speaker is Bryce Tellman, professor at the School of Mines and Technology in Rapid City, South Dakota. He holds a BA from Concordia in Nebraska and a PhD from Penn State in Happy Valley. You've heard of the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, down in Tennessee. Bryce is going to tell us about what almost was the Missouri Valley Authority. So welcome, Bryce.
Thank you very much, and I've been glad to hear the emphasis on how important a book project like this is, especially for early career scholars like me, working at institutions that really don't have much resources for humanities scholars like myself. So to have this opportunity to write things that I've written, published alongside people that I've cited in the past is really exciting, really important to someone like me. And so as John said, my chapter looks at essentially a case study of what would have been called the Missouri Valley Authority. And this chapter actually arose out of my dissertation, a chapter in my dissertation that was focused on Great Plains regionalism, basically looking at different versions of the Great Plains that we have seen or have been proposed, across the last 100 years or so. And I became interested kind of in alternative regional constructs, kind of alternative versions of the Great Plains throughout the last century or so. And, as Patrick pointed out, the Missouri River in the past has had this kind of region-making potential, but for the most part, we don't talk about the Missouri Valley in that way now. It doesn't have that much cultural purchase as a region, right? If I run into someone from Nebraska and I say, oh, I'm from West River in North Dakota, they're unlikely to say, oh, I'm from the Missouri Valley too, right? We have something in common. And I thought that was kind of curious, because in many ways it has a lot going for itself in this regard. And that caused me to happen upon the example of the MVA, or at least a series of MVA proposals. What would have been, as John pointed out, a plan patterned on the Tennessee Valley Authority to develop the Missouri River. And this plan essentially competed with the Pick-Sloan plan as to which one would be the government's official plan. And we know which one won out, of course. And so in my chapter, I don't get very much into the history of the plan itself. There's a couple other chapters that do that very well. But it's kind of a brief sketch of that. The Pick-Sloan plan, of course, arises from the Pick-Sloan and the Sloan plan, both of them very different plans to develop the river, and they're kind of at loggerheads. And it seems like an irreconcilable conflict until a plan for an MVA is proposed. And then suddenly, Pick and Sloan find that their differences aren't that extreme, and they kind of just smush those plans together. And the Missouri Valley Authority concept was threatening to both the Bureau, or the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation. And so for a number of years, you see this back and forth between proponents of what they call a unified development plan that would take the flood control, but also industrial and economic development into account on a valley-wide level or a basin-wide level, and what was sometimes seen as the more piecemeal approach of Pick Sloan. And so I'm really interested in what this historical episode can tell us about regionalism and the nature of how we make regions. And one thing that we see in this debate is the overwhelming importance of the upper valley, which usually has not enough water, and the lower valley, which often has too much water. So last week, actually exactly 1 week ago, I presented on this chapter at a hydrology conference, the Western Hydrological and Environmental Conference out in Rapid City. And among the hydrologists and geologists, a very different crowd, among them, this idea of this being kind of a natural division, the dry upper valley and the inundated lower valley, is almost an article of doctrine there. But it raises the question, for me, someone interested in kind of how we do region, raises a question about the role of difference and likeness when we talk about regions. And so there's this question of what do regions contain? I'm kind of a collector of definitions of region, and one of my favorite ones from a humanist by the name of Jenna Haley calls regions containers for stories. And so often when we talk about region, we look for similarity, right? We say this area is a region because the land there is like this, or the people there are like this, or they dip their fries and this sort of thing, right? Whatever it is. But one argument that gets made in favor of an MBA, or at least one kind of line of argument that those in favor of and those opposed to an MBA take, is about the nature of this difference between the upper and lower valley. So Arthur Morgan, well-known figure at the time, kind of comes out against this idea broadly, this idea of valley authorities. And he says the idea that river valleys can be administered for several purposes is a current delusion of the American mind. He says there's simply, the needs of the upper basin and the lower basin are simply too different. But Morris Cook, the hero of rural electrification, says that this difference, right, the fact that these parts of the valley have these different needs but are connected, that consequences flow through this region, is exactly why they need to be managed as one region. And so why this, for me, makes it an interesting and useful case study about regions generally, is that it brings our attention to the fact that regions are dynamic and active. They're not just borders that we draw around like areas. They have movement and flow within them. And working as I do at a school full of engineers, I know that movement and flow only happens across difference. And this has serious implications when we talk about being a group of people that deliberates about the best way to manage consequences. Because depending on how we draw these lines between the too close and intimate and the too remote and far apart, this has serious implications for what we mean when we say the people of the Missouri Valley. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dave Swanson, who is a professor of biology at the University of South Dakota, and he is the director of the Missouri River Institute down at USD, which will have a conference this fall, specifically to talk about the river, and I think some of us are going to be there to join in that discussion. He is the co-author of the third edition of the book Birds of South Dakota, and he is the author of Birder's Guide to South Dakota. I would just note as a footnote that this institution, Center for Western Studies, founded by Herbert Krause, we should note that Herbert Krause was a big birder, ornithologist, and there's some great photos of him out watching for birds upstairs. So, is Mark here?
He just came.
Oh, okay. I'll introduce him too. Co-author for Dave is Mark Dixon back there. He just rolled in. He's also a professor of biology down at the University of South Dakota. And he has many, many studies on American rivers, which I'll let you take a look at the bios in the back for. So, welcome Dave and Mark.
Thank you, and because this was a little different than the normal scientific articles that I write. And it was a lot of fun, and I'm kind of an armchair historian too, and so doing a little history of the ornithology of the basin was a really fun project to get involved in. And I want to start by getting you to think a little bit like a bird. And in terms of the Missouri River Basin, I think what makes it a really great place for bird biodiversity, and I should kind of preface that by saying there's over 400 species of birds that regularly occur within the Missouri River Basin. So that's a big chunk of birds. And part of the reason that there are so many birds there is the diversity of habitat. So bird biodiversity is really a story about habitats. So if you're looking at the basin in terms of a bird's eye view or a habitat's eye view of what's there, you go from the west to the east, so longitude of 112 all the way to 90 at St. Louis. That straddles the 100th meridian, which is kind of the unofficial boundary between east and west in North America. And birds don't know that boundary, but they kind of follow it anyway, because there's sort of sister species that occur in the east and the west. And if you live in South Dakota, you need both. I know they break a lot of the field guides to North America into eastern and western versions. If you live in South Dakota, you need them both, because the western part of the state has western birds and the eastern has eastern birds. And then in terms of latitude, it goes from 49 down to about 38 at St. Louis. And so you get some northern affinities in the northern part of the basin. You get southern affinities in the southern part. Elevation changes dramatic as well, and those affect habitat and those affect birds. So the story is there's a lot of habitats available that range, and I've listed a lot of them there. As you move down the river, it goes from grasslands to different kinds of forests, and so it's really a story of climate and habitat. And so the chapter that I wrote for this kind of breaks the history of ornithology down into 4 general periods, and I really focus on 3 of them in the chapter, and that's the sort of the indigenous knowledge, and then the period of kind of Euro-American exploration and government surveys that occurred throughout the 1800s. Another period where you kind of get the settlers did a lot of regional kind of apifaunas, and I don't talk about that much in the book. But then some modern ornithological research that occurred along the river too. So today I'll talk about the 1, 2, and 4 of those. So let's move on and talk about the indigenous knowledge. And most of that, of course, is passed down through oral histories. And so it's not all that accessible to Euro-Americans and to scientists and academics. But there's a really nice monograph that came out in 2017 that looked at the kind of the ethno-ornithology of the upper Missouri River Basin. And some of the highlights of that were that indigenous peoples considered birds as kind of cultural and spiritual symbols of great ceremonial importance, but they knew also a lot about behaviors. And so their folk taxonomies that kind of classified birds based on these different groupings, some of those were based on behaviors. And so, for example, the ravens and the crows, they consider tricksters, and that speaks a little bit to their intelligence. And the corvids that the ravens, the crows, and the jays belong to are one of the smartest groups of birds, most intelligent. So another example that I bring up in the book is common nighthawk, who is considered lazy, and that's because it doesn't build a nest; it lays the eggs right on the ground on the substrate that's there. So there's some really kind of insightful knowledge into some of the behaviors there. And this monograph lists not only that you can identify with certainty from these oral histories. It serves as kind of a really nice baseline for the ornithological knowledge of the region. And once you get to the Euro-American exploration, of course, it starts with Lewis and Clark. And I mentioned in the book the time periods that they moved up and down the river for all of these different expeditions. And the reason I mention that is, again, think from a bird's eye perspective here. If there are migratory birds, they might be here in the summer and then show up during spring and fall, but they're not here in the winter. Then there are other birds that come down to the Missouri River Basin, spend the winter, that aren't here in the summer. And so when you're around, dictates what kind of birds are available for you to see. So that's an important consideration, I think, to take into account. And so Lewis and Clark saw a lot of birds on the expedition. I think it was 134, I think is the number that's kind of generally agreed upon for how many of those. And I went through all the journals for every day they were in the Missouri River Basin. And along the Missouri River and the Jefferson River, which is one of the three forks, they saw 70 of those 134 species, including 14 of them that were new to science. And so that was an important addition to the ornithological knowledge of the region. And then following Lewis and Clark, there were a number of sort of privately funded expeditions, and I list them there. Duke Wilhelm went up before the steamboats, and so he was keelboats like Lewis and Clark. I mention that because it takes a lot longer to move very far if you're in a keelboat than if you're in a steamboat. And so Wilhelm only made it up to about current-day Chamberlain, South Dakota. And then Prince Maximilian and Audubon, a little bit later, steamboats were available. So they moved a lot farther. And Maximilian actually overwintered up in North Dakota. And then Audubon made it all the way into Montana as well. So they added a lot to the ornithological knowledge too. I think by the end of those private expeditions, the list for the region was up to about 160 or more bird species. And then following that in the 1850s and 1870s, there were actually several government-funded expeditions to the region. And Cal has summarized the bird knowledge from these regions in this book here. And now the species list, I think, is up to 332, which is about 75 to 80% of what is regularly occurring in the basin now. And so we had a pretty good handle on what was here by the end of the 1870s there. And so then I move on to talk about modern ornithology. And some of the main themes of research deal with bird habitat relations. I told you that from a bird's eye perspective, habitat is really key. And so investigating what characteristics or aspects of the habitat are important to birds is an important component of the research. Also, a lot of the human-induced changes. So the dams, of course, had big impacts on the flow, big impacts on the riparian forest and the successional trajectories that Mark is going to talk about here in a second too. But the creation of these large lakes that also attract some different birds. So there's some pluses and minuses in terms of bird biodiversity to these anthropogenic changes. And because the diversity of habitats from the upper to the lower river is so diverse, it's kind of hard to make some generalizable conclusions that apply across the whole basin, but I'm going to try to do a few anyway for you. And so one of them is that these anthropogenic changes cause some habitats to decline. And one of those declining habitats are sandbars. And so of the endangered species listed, bird species that are along the river, these two are the stars. And the least tern actually is recovered somewhat in terms of population. So it was actually removed from the endangered species list back in 2021. But the piping plover is still listed as threat. Both of these birds require bare sandbar habitat that's created by flooding and the removal of sediment upstream and the deposition of sediment downstream. And now that the dams are in, a lot of that sediment is filtered out into the reservoirs, and you don't get the formation of these sandbars very often anymore. We got some in 2011 after that flood, but typically you don't get a lot. And so these birds are endangered because of the lack of this sandbar habitat. And the last slide that I'll hit you with here is that there are some commonalities, and I think one of them is that the riparian forest that exists along the Missouri River is a really important habitat for regional biodiversity in terms of the abundance and the number of species that occur there. It supports the greatest number of birds of any habitat in the region. So riparian forests are really important. And then as you move along the river, local habitat characteristics at kind of the patch, forest patch and landscape scale are really important to birds too. So different birds have different characteristics, but these local characteristics seem to be very important. And then bird diversity tends to increase with the complexity of the vegetation too. And one of the interesting things about the Missouri River historically was when it had the successional trajectories. You had those bare sandbars that were created that were colonized by the early successional cottonwood willow forest, and Mark will tell you more about that. But that kind of matured into older cottonwood forest and then post-cottonwood climax forest. And all of those species, or all of those habitats, had different sort of indicator bird species that were associated with those. And then some of the differences, there are, of course, western birds in the western upper part of the basin, eastern birds in the lower part, and so that's one of the kind of changes that you see along the river. There's invasive tree species that have moved in along with the river regulation, and so responses to invasive species. And again, the story is some good, some bad with that. And then the successional trajectories along the river can differ too, so you don't really get the kind of wet meadow habitat that you see on the lower river that you do in the upper river. And so there are some differences in successional trajectories and habitats. And I mentioned that each of those habitats, and that's why I have the birds pictured there. The Dixisol is kind of a grassland specialist that shows up in these wet meadow habitats. The orchard oriole there in the middle is kind of an early successional forest cottonwood willow specialist. And then the rose-breasted grosbeak is a more mature forest specialist. And interestingly, I mentioned eastern to western Abraham. If you're in the upper Missouri River Basin, you don't get rose-breasted grosbeaks. You get black-headed grosbeaks. In the middle and lower river, you get the rose-breasted grosbeak. So that's one of the species pairs that I was talking about. So I think in terms of, I'm going to sum it all up, I think there's a lot still to know about habitat characteristics in birds and how those relate to conservation. And so I think that a lot of the modern research is going to focus on what specific habitat needs are required and how we can best meet those needs. So, thank you.
All right, thank you all. Didn't mean to get us so close. I think I had the wrong time or something. So let me go ahead and get started then. Thanks for the nice intro on a lot of my themes, Dave. We could have done it the other way. I could have led into some of yours, but I'll just move forward here with this. So, yes, that was the right arrow. So I just want to acknowledge my co-authors here. Carter Johnson. I don't know if some of you folks know Carter. Carter's been at SCSU for many years. He's an Augie grad. Okay. That's good, I guess, right? Mike Scott worked for the U.S. Geological Survey for many decades. It's from, I think originally it was from Sioux Falls, too, actually a long time ago. And some other joker. This is kind of a long time ago now. It seemed like 18 years. We were up in Smith's Grove, which, I think it's Smith's Grove. It's a place where there's humongous sized cottonwood trees up not too far from Mandan, North Dakota. And people have been trying to figure out, were they around when Lewis and Clark were going through or not? They don't really show in this picture. But anyway, these guys and I worked together for a number of years on Missouri River issues especially, and they are my two co-authors. So Carter particularly wrote about cultural and historical issues related to riparian forests, cottonwood forests along the Missouri River. Mike talked primarily about the upper river in Montana, and then I covered the middle river and lower river with more of an ecological focus. So, why cottonwood? I mean, cottonwoods are kind of an abundant tree, right? We see them all around neighborhoods. We get the seeds stuck in our window screens. But cottonwood is kind of the iconic tree of the Missouri River Basin. It's the most common species in the floodplain. It's kind of the most common. You get huge cottonwood trees, all the way down into little saplings that are coming up. And you can see that the distribution of plains cottonwood basically traces the Missouri River Basin. So it's really a characteristic tree of the Missouri River. It's a species that's really, it's what we call its life history. Life history characteristics are really tied in with dynamic rivers. We call it a pioneer species or a colonizing species that historically would have really benefited from a dynamic river that moved around, created sandbars with its cottonwood seedlings. Seeds can fly to or get deposited by water. They can sprout up in that open environment. And the other, they can go very quickly when they don't have a lot of competition. And so they were really well suited for the dynamic Missouri River as it used to be. Dave had mentioned, spoke specifically about birds and their use of the Missouri River, and in particular, looking at floodplain forests, which are dominated largely by cottonwoods, that these provide really important biodiverse areas along the river that are significant regionally, as David mentioned. So for nesting songbirds, which both of us have worked on quite a bit, which use, again, a variety of habitats, different stages, different ages of forest, if they're going through that dynamic process. The birds use it a lot for migration as they're passing up and down between breeding grounds and wintering grounds. And bald eagles really make heavy use of cottonwood trees and cottonwood forests. And there are also other species, endangered and more common, endangered species like the northern long-eared bat also uses riparian forests with cottonwood, for example. So important for critters and for biodiversity. Also really important culturally and historically. So the plains tribes, such as the Mandan, made heavy use of the Missouri River floodplain and including cottonwoods, in using those for building materials, and for fuel, situating winter village sites amongst floodplain forests, using the floodplain for crops, and so on. And so, to some extent, they really adapted their lifestyle to the dynamic of the river, the heartbeat of the river, and the floodplain. But cottonwood forests also had an important influence on westward expansion, westward exploration, and settlement of Euro-Americans. You could say quite literally that it helped to fuel that expansion because the steamboats burned prodigious amounts of cottonwood timber to fuel their trips, which actually had significant influence in certain places on the amount of forest that was remaining because of those woodlots, those wood yards. The trees sort of got some revenge, though, by sinking a lot of the steamboats, but we kind of got the last laugh by, modifying the river to suit our own needs. So, to some extent, it's kind of a big simplification, but a lot of native communities really adapted their lifestyle to the ebb and flow of the river. Euro-American settlers, to some extent, probably did that too, but really modified the river in the 20th century. And so given that modification, we can see its result, I guess, in just looking at the Missouri River system as it exists today, where it's really becoming a working river, right? We have these six or seven dams and reservoirs in the upper basin, the largest reservoir system in the U.S., or I think in North America. And then we have the lower 735 miles of the river that's been channelized for barge navigation and other things. So it's really been a very modified river in a lot of ways. And so a lot of this involves controlling the movement of water, right? How much of it is passed downstream, when it's passed downstream, how it's metered out, how it's used for hydroelectric power, how it's used to float barges. And so you can see from this historical hydrograph that a lot of the big floods largely got shut off after the dams went in. I'm not saying some big floods we've had recently, right? They've kind of gone against that trend. And it really changed the flow patterns and also the movement of sediment in the system. And so species like cottonwood that were really tied into that historical dynamic are likely to be greatly affected. And so these types of changes have left a big imprint on floodplain forests along the Missouri River. So overall, we estimated about a 70% decline in the amount of floodplain forest along the river since the 1890s, with much of this some of it being converted to agriculture, a lot of it occurring essentially at the bottom of the reservoirs now. with the bulk of the river in South Dakota being impounded. And also, there have been some of these declines probably were related to how the river has been sort of tamed and made more stable, less dynamic, fewer opportunities for young cottonwood trees to establish because it doesn't move around like it used to. It doesn't create sandbars like it used to. So some declines in that over time as well. And so then you're left with the forests that are already there, right? Those that were there before the dams went in. And of course, those are aging, right? So about two-thirds of the forests that we observed on the river established in the 1950s or before, essentially before the whole system of dams and reservoirs was in. So those forests are aging. And cottonwoods on the scale of lifespan compared to other tree species is kind of moderate to maybe even a little short oftentimes. And so a lot of these trees that are kind of just sitting there, in those same spots, we're going to lose some of those, or we are losing some of those just due to senescence and damage and stuff through stress. We've observed some sign of this already with some recent diebacks we've seen in cottonwood along the river near Vermilion, for example. And so even if we have those forests and they're a valuable resource, nothing sort of stays the same. Even though the river has become kind of static, the forests continue to change, and they change in a different direction without the dominant influence anymore of the river flooding and taking nutrients and doing other things. They've largely become disconnected from the river, where we are in southeastern South Dakota, with changes in water availability. And David mentioned invasive plant species. So there are a number of species of trees and shrubs that some of them are native to the region, some of them are not at all native to the region. So Russian olive, for example, is a big Eurasian species of tree that's become quite common. Red cedar is a native species of tree that you guys probably are familiar with, but it probably in the past was kept out of the floodplain by frequent flooding. That doesn't happen now, so it's really taken off, really increased. And other species also have, that composition of the forest is changing over time, with tree diseases and insect pests also contributing to that. A big die-off of American elm that happened in the late 60s, early 70s because of Dutch elm disease, and possible threats then to ash borer could change the content of those forests quite a bit as well. So I guess the question is, what's going to be the future of these forests? There's lots of different challenges, obviously, given that they're adapted to a system that's kind of no longer there, that's really changed considerably. So there's lots of threats. It's not quite as bad as this. Right? I mean, cottonwood trees are probably going to continue to be relatively abundant in the landscape in the right places, but the ecosystem as it existed is going to be diminished in area, in sort of its functional value, how connected it is to the river, and so on. So I guess the challenge going ahead is what can we do to try to conserve what we have, but also maybe bring back some of that functionality of these forests, both for our own good, as far as providing ecosystem services for us and enjoyment, as well as for biodiversity, other ecological values. Okay. That's all I've got.
Okay, we have copies of the book back here, so please pick them up if you can. They're available at the Center for Western Studies bookstore. They're available at Barnes & Noble. They're available from the University of Nebraska Press website. And please do share with your friends and on Facebook and let people know about the book. All right, now it's time to hear from our audience. You have a lot of experts here. Please fire away. John.
I grew up in Vermilion. Upper Vermilion exists because of the 1881 flood. And Darcy talked about flooding down in Omaha. And, you said the river's going to flow probably a third lower, less than usual. Sioux Falls is tapped out, and how much water we're sucking out of the pipeline. Now Bryce and his buddies want to steal water West River out there. Is there going to be enough water? I mean, then you think of the downstream states, they're not going to like Mr. Bart's draft.
Bryce, can you grab that microphone?
I didn't mean to pick on you personally.
No, so as I said, this is kind of a secondhand answer, but as I said last week, I was at a hydrology conference, and so there were a number of presentations on what has been proposed and is in the planning stages is a 6-foot pipeline to take water from the Missouri River to the Rapid City area, because we are drawing down aquifers there faster than their recharge rate. Now that's about 2,000 feet uphill. In addition to this, and this question came up a number of times at the conference, and in terms of the hydrologist's answer, in terms of comparing it to total flow of the Missouri, that it doesn't seem like there's a great deal of concern on the level of volume of water. Right? They would, but I have some potential concerns with how they answered the question. Right? And so they would point out, one of them I think said something like 89% of all surface water, flowing water in South Dakota is in the Missouri River. And so it's probably not a threat of, as we get to the Nebraska border, that the river will be dry. I think, though, it is a long-term question about, when we find that we're running up against some local barrier to growth, what do we do, right? Do we use that as a check on how we live and how we manage ourselves, or do we look, where can I take from? And I think that's one of those questions that we have historically avoided rather than answering.
Anybody else? Other questions? Yes, sir. Judge.
So one of the things that I've particularly been aware of on the Missouri River is the Oxbow Lakes. North Sioux City, McCook Lake, Carter Lake, and Iowa are probably the most noticeable. Are there a number of other Oxbow Lakes along this area of the Missouri?
Dave says yes.
I mean, there's a handful of them here and there. I'm thinking of one kind of east of Jefferson called Horseshoe Lake. And so there's a few others here and there kind of along the river too. So that drive kind of from Richland, South Dakota up north along that. Big Sioux has some oxbow lakes too that aren't really Missouri, but they're oxbow lakes that form. And so there's some of those both, I think, in the Missouri corridor and the Big Sioux corridor. Yeah, so an oxbow lake is, in case you don't know, is a bend in the river that got cut off from the river by a change in the channel. And the water remains as a kind of a oftentimes crescent or horseshoe-shaped body of water. Burbank Lake, of course, is one there too. But yeah, they're not really forming anymore, though, because they keep the river and the channel pretty much where it is. And so I think the oxbow lakes we got are the ones we're going to get.
I might just mention too that at least some of them towards the in South Dakota, our river channel, the Missouri River channel, is in size or downcut so much. I think within the stretch of river close to Vermilion, we estimate that it's about like at a kind of an average flow, it'd be about 2 meters lower for that same flow now than it would have been back in the 1950s. And so that means the floodplain and anything on it up here is much more perched than it was before. So if you have oxbow lakes, they're going to tend to be draining because the groundwater and the river level is declining, at least up here. If you go down farther south along the river where it's really channelized, up down towards Omaha and south of Omaha, it's kind of the opposite thing. There, parts of the river have kind of risen with sedimentation and such, and so they're much more connected. But they've channelized and put in levees and kind of cut off those oxbow lakes down there.
I think they pump into McCook Lake in order to keep the water level up.
I think I've heard that too, yes.
Yes, sir.
Sorry if somebody already covered this, but I thought I heard one time that the dams on the Missouri have a lifetime of something like 75 years when they were put in. And maybe even if you double that, it's not that long. What's the long-term plan when they silt in? When that lake silts in and it's done, what's the long-term plan?
I don't know. I think the only one that I know of that's really in imminent kind of there's plenty of siltation going on in some of the others, but the other reservoirs are huge, right? So Lewis and Clark is big. It's a big reservoir, but it's nothing like Sakakawea or Owyhee or Fort Peck. Those are big. They can actually probably take years and years and a lot of sedimentation without filling in. But Lewis and Clark's a lot smaller. I forget the estimate. A few years ago, the estimate was about 30% of the storage capacity was gone from sedimentation. And I heard that, still kind of a long time in the future, I heard projections of like 2175 that would be essentially filled in. I don't know. The Corps of Engineers I know has been studying that particular one because the people at Springfield and that community are concerned. They like to have their lake back. And they've been losing it to sedimentation and so on. So they've looked at lots of different ways. They've explored lots of different ways to try to lengthen the lifespan of the reservoir and to get sediment downstream where it's actually needed to keep the river from downcutting. But it's complicated. I don't think they found a really good way, sort of a way to do it at scale.
I know to this question I've been advised to look at the Pacific Northwest, which has now entered the era not of dam building, but of dam removal. Obviously most of those are smaller scale than the Big Sloan, but there is that idea that this is kind of part of the life cycle that is going to happen, just a question of when. And they're having to face some of these questions. How exactly do you do this? What do you then do with the landscape that's been inundated for a century? And so that may be where to look to see some of the imprint of what time scale who knows, but to come.
Why don't the old cottonwood forests reseed themselves? What's stopping the reseeding? It seems like whenever I see cottonwoods, there's always seedlings going on.
Yeah, at least sort of at scale, like along the river. Part of the issue is that historically cottonwoods were kind of what we call a fugitive species, that they tended to, you have the existing forest with lots of big trees and lots of seed falling down, but they're a shade intolerant species, and they kind of need moist conditions, they need bare ground essentially to do well, and so they very, very seldom will sort of grow up inside existing forests. Their life cycle was really built on river gouging out part of the bank, depositing a sandbar, creating a spot where the new seedlings can take off and just really grow. So I think it's largely just because there just aren't those types of areas being created as much anymore. And I think farther up, like on the banks, those areas are kind of perched now above the water table quite a bit as well. So I think they're just kind of getting squeezed out in terms of places where they can recruit because of the lack of the dynamics of the river channel now.
Other questions?
One way over.
Yes.
What state and county was that Cottonwood Lake in, is that in your slide?
Oh, the sign?
What was the state and county?
Oh. I should know that. I don't remember. I think that's somewhere in South Dakota. But I don't know. I should know that, but I don't remember where that's from.
Where's the town of Cottonwood? I bet someone knows this.
Isn't it east of Wall?
I think there's a lot of cottonwoods actually up by Watertown.
One out here. Sullivan County was here.
I mean, apparently there were only 12 people who lived there. I need to look into that. I knew it one time and I've forgotten where that is.
Yeah, the sign from the town is the one east of Wall. It's like, goes like Wall, Quinn, Cottonwood, Phillip. Yeah.
I just thought it was a cute sign, but I didn't remember where it was from.
Other questions? I have one. This is more of a cultural question, and that's about our level of consciousness of the river. I was in Kansas City last weekend, and there's a woman who wrote a book about how the river goes through Kansas City, and basically her spin on this is that people are not conscious of the river in places like Kansas City because it's been so channelized, and there's so much concrete, and people don't even recognize why Kansas City was set up in the first place, because it's on the river. Anybody want to comment?
sort of mission as the Missouri River Institute at the University of South Dakota to promote research, education, and outreach about the river. And so we're interested in generating some appreciation for the river. And I'm also on the board of directors of the Friends of the Missouri National Recreational River. So how many of you knew that we have a park just right down here, a national park here on the river? Yeah, a handful of you, but there's that Missouri National Recreational River is a National Park Service unit. And there's two parts of it that are below Fort Randall Dam down to about Niobrara, and then below Gavin's Point down to Ponca State Park. And the river in those regions is about as natural as it gets anymore. I like to call it free-flowing, but Mark doesn't let me do that very well. Because the water goes where it wants below the dams, but the dams determine how much water it gets to go where it wants. And so those sections are really great sections for recreating and appreciating the river as it was, at least to some degree. But I don't think a lot of people are very familiar with the Park Service units. And they have a headquarters in Yankton. They do quite a bit of programming there, so there are options to take advantage of it. And there are also a lot of canoe and kayaking events that take place over the summer on the river. So there's a lot of opportunities, but I do think it's not very well appreciated.
I'd add just a little bit to that, and that is, you think about the Missouri Right, it's kind of shrinking. You talked about the water table going down, but if you go to the University of Mary in Bismarck and you look down, it looks like a river. Whereas for most of our conversation in South Dakota, as you're going across the interstate, it looks like a lake. And so there's a disconnect, just visually, kind of symbolically, that we forget it's a lake because of the dams that created these reservoirs. And with the lack of height, we don't see in the distance, we don't get that vista that a river tends to entertain. So I think there's a kind of psychological disconnect on how we view the river, simply because of the way in which we've situated the roads relative to the river. You need that kind of University of Mary Bismarck overlook to get a sense of the river as it flows. So I think that does matter.
Yeah, I mean, growing up in Omaha, I think the Missouri's far more, visible there. You're going to cross it all the time. And, but I think it's, I don't know that I ever thought of it until now as, in terms of kind of its nature and what it used to be before the dam system. I mean, I think we often thought of it as like a gross muddy river. Like, you're not going to want to, and that there's recreation on it, but that it was sort of a negative view almost. I mean, just like a river, but not a beautiful river, but but we just don't know. I think we don't talk enough about kind of what David and Mark has.
I will say too, John, that the trout fishermen know about Missouri River in Montana, that's for sure. I've fished there a couple of times myself and had one of my best days fly fishing ever out there. So it's a section below the Coulter Dam, so there's some dams up there, and the outflow of those dams comes off the bottom of the lake, so it's always constant cold water, and it's great for trout. Probably back in the Lewis and Clark days, they might have been getting into trout about there, but there's a lot more of them now. Most of them are browns and rainbows, which aren't native to the stream either.
You're having a mind meld with the son of Norman McLean, because when I talked to him, he said, go just south or just downstream from Coulter Dam, because that's where the cold water is. We have a question right there.
How navigable is the Missouri River to start and finish? Can boats go up the river? And locks and dams and whatever?
Yeah, there aren't any locks. They're dams and big storage reservoirs. So, those you'd have to portage around them, I guess. But I think there are people who do like large portions of the Missouri River. And I guess what they have to do is pick up and walk around the dams or whatnot. Upstream, it's not used for commercial sort of boating. But downstream, the lower 735 miles has been designed for commercial boating, for navigation, for barge traffic. And so that, all the infrastructure there, a lot of it is really designed around that. But that goes, like, let's say, basically up to Sioux City, and then after that, it's not really navigable for that purpose anymore, above Sioux City. But below it, the lower 735, it's definitely used for that. Although I've also heard that there's a bit of controversy, but people say that, you know, do we really need it all the way to Sioux City? Because how many barges actually go north of Omaha? But
One more, John.
Okay, so I grew up in Vermillion. Our mascot was the Tanager, the little red bird. We put the fear of God in the football team, the Tanager rolled in. Are there tanagers? I've never seen a tanager. Are they common? Or?
They are along the river. They tend to like upland more than riparian forests. And so the places around Vermillion where I'd say go see them is get up into that bur oak forest above Mulberry Point Overlook. There's tanagers in there.
Okay.
Yeah. And so they do tend to like the oak forest.
So we want to increase consciousness and awareness of the river and the history and culture of the river. So please spread word of the new book, America's Longest River. Copies are here. Copies available from Barnes & Noble, Center for Western Studies bookstore, and University of Nebraska Press website. So please, let's give one final round of applause to our contributors.